Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about the Advanced Decline Index for the top 100 cryptocurrencies. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. One of the things I've been pretty clear about in the pre-halving year is that altcoins tend to significantly underperform. And one of the things I've suggested many times this year is that exposure to the cryptoverse during the pre-halving year, if you limit it to just Bitcoin, you will often outperform a portfolio that is heavy in altcoins. The reason for that is because in the pre-halving year, the Bitcoin dominance tends to go higher, no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, right? And charts like this can show you that perspective, but in a completely different way. All right. So if you're not familiar with the Advanced Decline Index, it's actually something that's very commonly used in the stock market to get an idea of the breadth of a move. You may have heard over the last year people talk about the Magnificent Seven in the stock market and how a lot of, basically all of the gains in the S&P 500 are thanks to seven stocks who have just been going up, far more than a lot of the lower market cap stocks. So those seven have helped to support higher valuations in the S&P 500. Now, you could make a similar case for the cryptocurrency asset class, but the reason is not really because of the altcoins, right? It's mainly because Bitcoin has sort of held the market up, right? And this chart can really help to explain that. If you're not familiar with the Advanced Decline Index, like sort of the definition of it, you can pause the video here and read everything, but I'll probably read through most of it regardless. An asset is said to have advanced over a certain time period if the closing price is above the opening price for that period, right? So if we're thinking about, how many cryptocurrencies have advanced yesterday out of the top 100, right? It would just simply be the number that closed the day at a higher valuation than where they opened the day, okay? So on the other hand, if an asset is said to have declined, then the closing price for that period that you're looking at is lower than the opening price. So the period could be like a daily period, it could be a weekly, it could be all sorts of things, but you could measure it over various time frames. Now, the Advanced Decline Index is calculated by taking the daily advances minus the daily declines. Okay, so if you think about it, if you had X amount of daily advances out of the top 100, you had Y amount of daily declines. You take X minus Y plus PIV, which stands for the prior index value, right? So it does have some information as to what was going on previously in the calculation. That way we can better understand the general trend of where it's headed. The ADI, or the Advanced Decline Index, can be seen as the running sum of the difference between daily advances and daily declines. So in a macro bull market where everything is going up, you would expect this Advanced Decline Index to trend higher, would you not? And if you think back to what was going on over here in the halving year, what happened in the halving year of January of 2020? What happened? This index bottomed out, right? It bottomed out basically at the end of the pre-halving year, providing some signal that perhaps the Bitcoin dominance was topping out for at least a little while, right? At least some signal, because we were starting to see some of the altcoins show some form of a recovery, okay? They were starting to close at higher valuations than where they were opening in somewhat of a sustained way, okay? And you might say, well, what about March 2020? It's true that in March 2020, we had a massive pullback, and a lot of those cryptocurrencies put in new lows, but they quickly came out of it, and the ADI continued to put in higher lows all the way until November of 2021, where it finally topped out at this high here, and then ever since then, it's been putting in lower highs and lower lows, okay? So look at last cycle. You see how it topped out here at the very end of 2017, early 2018. This stayed in a downtrend even through the second half of 2019. It did not bottom out until literally early 2020, right? The very beginning of 2020. And so the reason I follow the Bitcoin dominance so closely is so that I can help save people from a lot of the pain that I've experienced in the altcoin market of just seeing these altcoins bleed not only for the bear market year where Bitcoin mainly goes down, but also for the pre-halving year where Bitcoin basically, spends half the year going up and half the year going down, right? You see altcoins bleed no matter what. It's kind of like how a lot of altcoins just keep on putting in new lows, like every single week, right? We look at, there's another altcoin. Oh, there's another one going and putting in a new low. And this is the case for a lot of the altcoins. And you can really see the overall trend here. Remember, in 2019, the second half of 2019, a lot of altcoins were putting in new lows, even though Bitcoin wasn't. And in early 2020, a lot of altcoins put in much lower lows than they did in December of 2018, even though Bitcoin put in a higher low. So the argument has always been that whatever the secondary scare for Bitcoin materializes into, whether it's a higher low, a double bottom, or a lower low, it would likely cause a lot more pain in the altcoin market. And remember, last cycle, this didn't even bottom out until the end of the pre-halving year or the early phase of the halving year. And that still didn't mark the low for most altcoins because we ended up getting a recession. Now, that recession was theoretically brought on by the pandemic. I know some people would dispute that. It's kind of a moot point, to be completely honest, because there's no way to really prove or disprove any of it. I mean, we had an inverted yield curve, we had a recession, but I also think that without the pandemic, who knows what would have happened? I mean, there have been prior inverted yield curves that didn't lead to a recession. I think 1966 was one. Or it could have just been that maybe we would have had a recession, but perhaps we would have waited a little bit longer for that to happen. It could have just mean the economy was sick and was waiting for a reason to sell off, right, after the inverted yield curve, theoretically like it could be doing today. So when I look at this chart, there is something that anyone who's looking at this chart while I've been sort of rambling on, that should really catch your eye. What's going on right now? Look at this. Look at this ADI, the Advanced Decline Index, is plummeting right now. Do you see that? It's absolutely plummeting right now. It's actually below where it went back in 2019, right? It's below that. Also note that in 2019, it topped out at a higher level than it topped out in 2023. So when I look at this chart, and people keep calling for, they keep saying that we're in alt season and all this other stuff on every single lower high, right? I look at this and I'm like, where are they getting that from? Like, most altcoins just keep putting in new lows. Now, you can go cherry pick a few and try to make the case, make the alternative case and say, well, these altcoins are doing well. And that might be true for some altcoins. The ones that tend to do the best at this phase of the cycle are newer altcoins that they don't really have all the drama from the prior, from the bear market. They are probably going to be lower in market cap. The ones that are higher in market cap that do well often had much larger sell-offs in the bear market year than the ones that didn't. So, there are some altcoins that have had some impressive moves this year, but those also were the ones that also likely got sold off the most last year. And so a lot of that move could just be mean reversion. But I'm looking at this chart and saying, like, what's going on here? Because, this is dropping really quickly. And then you go look at total market cap and you're like, well, it's been trending sideways for basically the entire year. And that's not necessarily a popular view to state, because a lot of people wouldn't want to believe that, and they would say, well, there's no way you could argue that the total market cap has been going sideways all year, right? Like, we know that, a lot of people might say, well, we know that's not true because Bitcoin has gone up a lot, right? So there's no way. But if you look at where we were at the beginning of the year, we were a little bit lower, but pretty early on in January, we got up to a market cap of 1 trillion in January. And we are at that market cap today, right? The market cap of the asset class has not really changed this year, except for the very initial move. Okay, so we had this initial move off the lows, and then it's basically gone sideways ever since, right? But how can that be, right? I mean, Bitcoin went up a ton, right? If you look at Bitcoin, the Bitcoin chart, you can see that it still kept going up after January, right? It still went up. And in fact, it was putting in new highs as late as July. The issue is that a lot of other coins were not. I mean, if you look at Ethereum, it topped out in April. It didn't put on a new high in July. If you look at ADA, right, it topped out in April and has been moving down ever since. Take a look at Avalanche, right? It topped out in February, or late January, early February. And it just keeps going lower. This is one that was putting in new lows 2 to 3 weeks ago. Look at Polkadot, another example of a coin that has been putting in new lows this week, right? Go take a look at Litecoin, right? When did it peak? When it always peaks in the pre-halving year, right? June or July, or not the pre-halving year, or the pre-halving year for Bitcoin, but June or July of the halving year for Litecoin. A lot of people on Twitter were, very against me talking about how it tends to peak out just before the halving. And they said this time's going to be different. And guess what? It wasn't different. It topped out just before the halving, just like it always does, right? Just before the Litecoin halving, just like it always does. And so when you look at a lot of these altcoins and you kind of look to see what they've accomplished this year, most of them haven't really accomplished anything in the grand scheme of things. I mean, like Litecoin started the year off. I believe the yearly candle for Litecoin is red. Okay, look at the 12-month candle for Litecoin, right? It's down almost 12%, right? Down almost 12% this year. So, when you look at a lot of the altcoins, a lot of them have just gone down since the summer, and some of them have gone down since April, and some of them have gone down basically since the start of the year. So it's fascinating to me when you look at Bitcoin and you see just how much it's gone up. But the reason it went up, as I've tried to articulate quite often, is not because of a lot of new money coming into the space. I think that has been fairly clear, because if a lot of new money were coming into the space, why would total market cap be at the same level that it was at in January, right? If you're going to go out there and say and try to make the case that the reason Bitcoin's so much higher is because so much money has come into the market, how can that be true? Because if so much money came into the market this year, why has total market cap been at the same valuation that it was at in mid to late January, right? I mean, you're talking about the last 9 to 10 months, and the total market cap of crypto hasn't really changed. So the reason it's up the reason this is sideways is because Bitcoin went up and the collective altcoin market has gone down, right? The altcoin market topped out in April, and it has just continued to go down. So when you look at something like the ADI or the Advanced Decline Index, this chart articulates that view quite well, the Bitcoin dominance view. And the Bitcoin dominance view states, especially in pre-halving years, that it's okay. Like, people always ask me, like, well, what about, is DCA okay? What? And my answer is always the same, right? DCA for Bitcoin tends to work out as long as you have a long enough time horizon. DCA for altcoins can often not work out, right? And a lot of people might say, well, just you wait, right? Just you wait, and you're going to see these altcoins go to new highs, right? That is often a common response, right? The issue with that response is that thesis is based on survivorship bias, right? So if you were to go back and look at what the altcoins that did really, really well in 2020 and 2021, a lot of those altcoins that did well were new altcoins that did not even exist in 2016, 2017. And some of the altcoins did go on to put in new all-time highs, right? And I know, and there were some that I talked about on my channel, right? We talked about Cardano, we talked about Chainlink, and we talked about a few new coins that came out, and a lot of them did very, very well. But for every one of those that went to new all-time highs, you could probably find like 50 or 100 others that did not, go to all-time highs, that just put in a much lower high. And so the argument of just sort of waiting and sort of seeing that the altcoin market will recover, I agree with the statement that the altcoin market will recover, in the sense that I think that the total three, the measure of the altcoin market, I think that this will eventually recover, right? Maybe, I mean, I still think there's probably going to be some pain ahead, but I think that as a whole, the altcoin market will recover. The issue is not will the altcoin market recover in my mind, it's will the altcoins that people are DCAing, will those recover? And there might be 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 50 or 1 out of 100 that go on to put in new all-time highs, but a lot of them can just go away, right? A lot of them, and the reason they just go away is because a lot of times you have all these teams that came together and they, maybe they had they promoted these coins. There's maybe these various these unlocks of these coins and whatnot. And when you go into another bull market, you have to think, like, for them, is it easier for them to just create something new, the new shiny object on the block, based around whatever the most recent narrative is in the cryptoverse? Or is it to sort of, go to an older coin that has bag holders that bought all the way down and try to get that one moving again, right? A lot of times these teams will just opt to choose a new altcoin to promote rather than to stick around with a project that was from a prior cycle. This is not always the case. Like, there are some altcoins that have developer teams that do stick around from one cycle to another, and they provide utility that leads new people in the market, and then those altcoins go to new all-time highs, right? So the first test for an altcoin is, if it was around in 2016, 2017, did it go to new all-time highs in 2020 and 2021? If it did, great. That is at least a good thing for that cryptocurrency, and could mean that it has a future. But what about the altcoins that didn't? And there's a lot of those. There's a lot of those that didn't. And what I want to focus on here, though, is, do you see just how quickly this is going down? But Bitcoin is not. Bitcoin is not. So what's going on? There's a lot of altcoins in the top 100 that are in pretty serious declines right now. And a lot of people are completely ignoring it. A lot of people are ignoring it. And they're in serious declines. And the only reason people are ignoring it is because Bitcoin's doing okay, right? Bitcoin's doing okay. So it's easy to sort of discount those, right? It's easy to say, all right, well, DOT just put in a new low. Avalanche just put in a new low. ADA is basically hugging these lows, right? It's easy to overlook that because, and even Ethereum, Ethereum just sort of keeps pushing lower. But it's easy to overlook it because, well, we just look at Bitcoin and we're like, well, it's holding on strong. So then it goes back to what I've said before, right? Like, if you want exposure to the cryptoverse in the pre-halving year, Bitcoin can often offer you, a decent amount of exposure to the upside while also minimizing your downside risk in the altcoin market. Now, some people think that means that Bitcoin can't go down. It can. I mean, it went down in the second half of 2019. It even went down in the early phase of the halving year last cycle. So it can go down. It's just that if it does go down, it's likely going to take the altcoin market with it. And we saw Bitcoin go up for the first half of the year, was putting in new highs in July. And even though Bitcoin was going up, a lot of the altcoin market topped out in April. ADA topped out in April. AVAX topped out in January, early February. Ethereum topped out in April. Doge topped out in April as well this year. Link, it's just been putting in lower highs so far. We'll see. We'll see what happens here. But this year the highest it went was in April. Litecoin, the highest it went was in June, July, early July. So, when I look at these market conditions, a lot of people, they're ready for the bull market, right? And I'm like, well, in what? Right? In what? And the truth is, a lot of people are very exposed to altcoins, but not Bitcoin. Right? Why do you think social sentiment dropped so much this year? Because Bitcoin's gone up 2x, right? It's because the altcoin market keeps putting in new lows. And the truth is that a majority of the investors in the cryptoverse, they don't care that much about Bitcoin, right? A lot of them don't. They like whatever the new shiny altcoin is, and they want to go buy that. But if those keep going down, then the sort of the more fringe investors that are just trying to, to sort of, make a quick buck, right? They tend to leave because it just gets harder and harder to do so. And the truth is, they would have all been much better off ignoring the altcoin market this year and just kind of sticking around in Bitcoin, because most of those altcoins are at lower Satoshi valuations today than they were at the beginning of the year. So I'll say again, in the pre-halving year, it is often best, not financial advice, but it is often best based on historical results to, let me phrase it like this. In the pre-halving year, Bitcoin heavy portfolios tend to outperform altcoin heavy portfolios. And if you measure your portfolio in terms of its Satoshi valuation, a lot of people would clearly see that, right? And one really quick trick to do that, to do something like that, is to go take a look at an altcoin, right? Like, go take a look at these cryptocurrencies on their Bitcoin pairs, and then just sort of take the inverse of it, right? Or 1 over. And look at this chart of 1 over Ether Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin Ether valuation, right? Like, at the beginning of the year, 1 Bitcoin would have fetched you about 13 ETH. Now it fetches you about 17 ETH. Okay? 8 a Bitcoin, right? 1 over, take the inverse of it. At the beginning of the year, 1 Bitcoin would have fetched you about 57,000 ADA. Today, it fetches you about 108,000 ADA, right? So it goes to show you, right? I mean, like, it's nothing personal with the altcoins. It's just that when you're in an environment where liquidity is flowing out of the asset class, people tend to hunker down in the lowest risk asset in that asset class. It's the same argument for the Magnificent Seven, right? The reason that a lot of the micro caps or a lot of the lower market cap companies haven't done as well is because liquidity is slowly being drained. And so when liquidity is being drained, a lot of people just sort of hunker down in what they think are the lower risk plays, like Apple and Google and Microsoft, right? But then the issue is that eventually there's no longer sufficient liquidity in the rest of the market to support higher valuations in what is considered, quote unquote, the blue chips. And then that's when even the giants fall, right? And I've said that many times. In the end, even the giants will fall. Like, in the end, Ether Bitcoin is dropping, right? In the end, even Bitcoin will probably bend the knee, and we'll have to figure out how low the secondary scare goes before we really get that move into sort of a more sustained bull market. There's one interesting thing to look at with Bitcoin in the last 2 cycles, and that is, look what really kickstarted the bull market. I mean, if you want to say that the bull market started here, that's fine. But the issue is that the real move to all-time highs did not come until this massive capitulation wick, right? This massive move to the downside. This week, Bitcoin dropped 33%. The wick was pretty far down. Okay? That 1 week, Bitcoin dropped 50%. Okay? Now, look at 2015. Look at this. Look at this move. 12% from open to close. But look at this drop, how far down Bitcoin went in 1 week. 38%. 38%. So 38% drop here in 1 week. And then it led to a fresh bull market that took us to new highs. Here, 50% in 1 week. And it led to a fresh bull market that took us to new highs. But what do you notice about this period right here, March 2020, in the Advanced Decline Index? The smaller market cap coins were already starting to show relative strength. They were already starting to show relative strength. The ADI was starting to go up, right? It had bottomed out already, the end of the pre-halving year, and was starting to move higher. And we had that capitulation, but it was a higher low on the ADI, and the market continued to go up. Right now, we are seeing absolute capitulation in the ADI. It is dropping like a rock. And the reason, as I've said before, liquidity is leaving the cryptoverse, and these altcoins are extremely dangerous right now, because until the Fed pivots, until liquidity comes back, these altcoins can just keep slowly going down. So, sort of recap here. The reason total market cap is going sideways for basically the entire year, except for that initial move off the lows in January, is not because the altcoin market is propping it up, because the altcoin market, right, here, it's not even up that much this year collectively, right? 12 months candle. Look at this. Altcoin market is up 10% this year. 10%. Bitcoin this year is up 62%. So the reason total market cap had that initial move and has held it is because Bitcoin is up. Not because the altcoin market is doing spectacular things, because it's not. Right? The altcoin market is not doing much of anything great at this point. Take a look at Total 3 again, right? This is where it is. Look at last cycle with Total 3, right? I mean, you had a red candle, a red candle. This one was a green candle with a large upside wick, green candle, upside wick. What do you notice about this candle, though? It also had a somewhat substantial wick to the downside as well, to the tune of, what, 14%? A 14% move to the downside on this wick would put Total 3, at 249 billion or so. And that's not even as low as it went, right? I mean, it certainly went lower the following year to that wick, right? Which was 27% below that yearly open. 27% below this yearly open puts Total 3 at around 214 billion. So, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I've had this thesis for a while that there's not really a lot of new money coming into the space. Now, there is a nuance to that. There is, I'm sure there is some new money coming into the space, right? Like, it's not like there's no one new in 2023 that wasn't here in 2021, right? I'm sure there are some new people coming into the space, but the counterpoint is that the new people are essentially just sort of offsetting attrition, right? Like, yes, you might have 10 new people come in, but there might also be 10 people leaving as well. And I mean, that's not even entirely true because the social metrics just keep going down, right? So I don't even think you can make the case that it's even offsetting attrition. But you can understand that, yes, there are probably some new people into the space. It's just that they're not really offsetting the people that are leaving. So when I look at this chart, I say, well, has there ever been a period in history where it dropped this quickly, right? Where it dropped this quickly? Because this is dropping really quickly here. And Bitcoin at this point is still kind of holding on, right? And I'm not saying that it can't. I mean, it just, I look at it and I'm like, this is kind of not something we've seen. Not that much anyways, right? I mean, there's some periods where you can see it dropping, but this is a pretty sharp sell-off right here. Maybe sell-off's not the right word. This is an index, right? Just a pretty large drop. And so I say, well, has it ever happened before? And I sort of scroll back through and I'm like, well, I mean, even this, the angle of attack here is still not as steep as this thing. I mean, this is just, it's like it's dropping off a cliff. Perhaps this is the clearest similarity, right? Like this drop here. And what's fascinating about this drop by the ADI is that the drop started before Bitcoin really saw a drop itself, right? Look at this, right? I mean, the ADI was already starting to go down. Let's look at it on this scale here, right? So you can see that it started to drop. Bitcoin is still not dropping, right? Like on that chart, you can see that Bitcoin is still at 6K, right? Well, this is total market cap, but I mean, you can imagine if it were Bitcoin, it would still be at 6K. But then eventually, Bitcoin fell off too. And I think the reason or the argument is, well, why did Bitcoin fall off, right? Wasn't there liquidity to go from the altcoin market to Bitcoin? So why did Bitcoin fall off? I think the issue is that it reached a tipping point, which is there was no longer sufficient liquidity in the altcoin market to support the valuation of Bitcoin USD, right? That's the argument, is that there just simply wasn't enough liquidity anymore to support it. And then Bitcoin dropped, crushed the altcoin market, and then we started to move higher, right? We started to move higher. So I look at this and I'm like, well, there's not really a lot of historical context for a drop like this, except for maybe the end of 2018. And it doesn't have to play out the same way, right? It certainly doesn't have to. And certainly, while the drop over here did sort of precede Bitcoin's drop, it only preceded it by like a few days, right? So if it is to be meaningful at all, you might assume that would need to play out soon. Otherwise, it might not have as much meaning. Okay. Now, there's also this period over here where you can see the ADI was dropping and the total market cap was going up. But this is just another great example of total market cap can go up because maybe Bitcoin is going parabolic, or maybe a few of the altcoins are going parabolic. But a lot of them could still be going down because liquidity is leaving those altcoins and going into the ones that are sort of part of the next narrative. Okay? So you have to be careful. You have to be careful about spreading yourself too thin amongst 100 different altcoins, because a lot of them might just go to zero. And that's why I have said for the entire year, a DCA strategy for Bitcoin tends to work best over longer periods of time rather than trying to time the top or the bottom. And second of all, if you're going to DCA something, like if you want exposure to crypto, there's Bitcoin in the pre-halving year. Now that might change, that thesis might change in the halving year, and we'll talk about that once the halving year is here. But we're still not in the halving year yet. It's still the pre-halving year. And history shows us that altcoins tend to bleed against Bitcoin for most, if not all, of the pre-halving year. And this right here is showing you that a lot of these altcoins just continue to sort of continue to put in new lows, right? So what you would like to see is, some type of a bounce and a higher low on the ADI. But we haven't seen that, right? Over here, once it bounced and put in a higher low, altcoins were still basically at their bottoms. They were still at the lows. When it bounced over here and put in a higher low, altcoins were at much lower valuations. But it was still a higher low. We don't even know if we put in the low yet, much less the higher low. And last cycle, the first low didn't even come, the final low didn't even come until January 2nd of the halving year, right? Which is still 2.5 months away for this cycle. 2.5 months away. So I think this is an interesting metric. I really do. And the only reason I'm making a video on it today is because this sort of caught my eye as this is selling off, or this is dropping very, very quickly. And there's not that many times in history where we've seen the ADI drop this quickly. So what does it tell us? It tells us the breadth of the market has not been there, right? The reason total market cap is up is not because the altcoin market is holding it up over the last few weeks, right? Like if you were to look at total market over the last 2 months, the reason it's here is not because the altcoin market is holding it up, right? From August 14th to now, total 3 is lower than it was back then, right? I mean, look at this weekly close August 14th, 327 billion. Now it's at 320 billion. So the reason total market is here, 1.04 trillion to 1.033 trillion, a slight drop. But the reason it's still holding on is not because the altcoin market, it's because of Bitcoin, right? It's because Bitcoin is off the lows. Look at this move by Bitcoin off the lows August 14th. Closing price, 26K, 26.2. Right now, 26.9. Where was Ethereum that week, August 14th? 1685, the close. Where is it now? 1555. So you can kind of understand why the ADI is going down, is because all this liquidity is draining out of the altcoin market and into either fiat or stable coins or Bitcoin. And I think that's why Bitcoin is stronger, relatively stronger, right? That's why you can clearly see that Bitcoin has been relatively stronger than the altcoin market for a while. That's why the dominance of Bitcoin continues to trend higher, right? You can see the dominance of Bitcoin just continues to trend higher. And even though a lot of people keep saying it won't, it just keeps going up, right? So the altcoin market is bleeding. Bitcoin has shown relative strength compared to the altcoin market, but not because new money is coming in my opinion. It's just because people are converting their alts to Bitcoin. The issue, as I've stated many times, is we tend to get a secondary scare where liquidity runs out from the altcoins who support the valuation of Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin drops, crushes the altcoin market. We get this massive like liquidation cascade, and then we start anew, right? And then the Fed pivots, liquidity comes back, and then the altcoin market starts to do well again and starts a trend of higher lows and higher highs. Last cycle, the trend of higher lows and higher highs in the altcoin market did not even start until the halving year, right? It did not even start until the halving year. And that is why I have been relentless in the view here that altcoins do not make, in my opinion, not financial advice, but altcoins do not make a great investment in pre-halving years and in bear market years because they tend to bleed against Bitcoin. And look, again, you can go cherry pick a few altcoins that have held up, and congratulations if you were an investor in those. I'm not trying to take that away from you, okay? But you can see the clear trend, right? You can see the clear trend, and this is concerning how quickly this is dropping off. Does this mean that liquidity is leaving very fast right now, and that's why altcoins just continue to drop? Because when this happened over here in 2018, it didn't lead to anything good, right? We saw a massive drop in the market very quickly, and then we started to trend back up again. So just something to keep an eye out for, and we'll see how this continues to evolve, especially as we get into the latter part of the year, like November, December, and then early part of next year. Because by the early part of next year, who knows? Maybe this will have put in a low. Maybe we then get a recession and it puts in a higher low. And perhaps altcoins put in lower lows in their USD pairs, but then they quickly pick up the trend as liquidity comes back because the Fed pivots, because they have to come to rescue the equity market, right? So that's more or less my view on the market. I think I've been fairly consistent in that view all year. I know it's not necessarily been a popular view, but I think at the end of the day, a lot of these altcoins have put in new lows. Ethereum topped out in April. I think Bitcoin probably topped out in July. It normally tops out in the summer of the pre-halving year, with the exception of 2015. And that's my view on the market, right? Go listen to someone else to figure out what their views are, because I'm sure they're probably looking under rocks that I'm not looking under. They have a perspective that I'm not considering. That's my view on the market. The ADI is dropping. Liquidity is leaving the altcoin market. A lot of them are in very precarious positions. ADUSD is trying to hold these lows. A lot of people are hopeful that it'll hold. But what if AVAX is kind of telling what'll happen, right? AVAX already dropped below the lows, back tested it, and keeps going down. DOT already went below these lows, right? I mean, test it, eventually break down. Again, AVAX, same thing. Test it, test, eventually break down. ADA, test, eventually it likely breaks down. And at some point, enough of the altcoin market breaks down where total 3, the collective altcoin market, breaks off of support, right? It breaks off. I don't know how you want to draw this trend line, right? But at some point, if you just connect the wicks, I guess, maybe we exclude this one, sort of this wick here, can sort of connect the dots, A, B, C, D. If we come in and if enough altcoins take out those lows on their that we're just looking at, then total 3 eventually takes this out, and then who knows how far down the drop is if Bitcoin rolls over. So that's what we're looking at. That's what I'm looking at. Advanced Decline Index. Here's the description. Here's the usage of it if you want to read that. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.